I decided to go to the larger pulley for the alternator. So this is the one that came off. This is the one I'm going to put on. It's about a half an inch bigger overall. And they're very similar, but the one difference is these two bosses right here, right there, this one's bigger. And the problem with that is that the surface that this mates against is inboard of the outside edge of the alternator. So this is, right now, this would touch the alternator, which would just bind it up. So I'm just going to turn it down to this size with my lathe. About 4 thousandths more. So just a nice light cut. This is slow so we get a decent finish on it. Not that anybody will see it. Clean up that inside edge a little bit. $10.21, $10.20, so it's 1/1000th oversized, and I think we can probably live with that. So you can see we returned it off. This is a little bit bigger here because I went out just to clean it up a little bit. But that should do it, and of course there's plenty of meat there. You don't have to worry about that. There's nothing left to do but go put it back on the car. Alright. This is the new pulley. Slides on. Goes back okay. Now I suppose the difference is this was flat and this has got a little taper on it. It doesn't seem to be hitting anything. Let's just see where we lined up. Maybe we can put a little washer back there and grab some room. So I found a washer with the right outside diameter. The center was too small. I didn't actually have too lazy to find a big drill bit that size, so I just threw it in the lathe and turned the center out a little bit because I'm lazy. I know it's kind of overkill. A little 1/8 inch thick washer on the lathe, but you know, what the heck. So that goes on here. In fact, why don't I zoom you in a little bit so you can see better. There we go. So you can see here, now this is the casing, and the piece that the bush, the end of the pulley goes against is recessed, not quite a 1/4 inch. So this is just about 1/8 of an inch. When I put the pulley on before, this edge was just off of there, maybe 30 thousandths or something, and it probably would have been alright, but I just didn't like how it looked. So this is on there now. It looks like it's got about 1/8 of an inch left. So we just need to put the nut back on. I don't know if you ever tried to take a pulley off an alternator or something by hand. I remember my dad trying to have me do that when I was a kid. As you know, air tools are too expensive. It is incredibly difficult to try to get something to hold on to that, to grab that big bolt on an alternator that had been back east, so in the bad weather, the salt and everything else, and it was probably 10 or 15 years old. So I fought for that thing for hours. Now you know why I own air tools. So, hopefully, I should be able to slide this back over. What they say is you should put this pulley on first, because it's smaller diameter and it's got a fairly large edge. Not to mention you're competing for the same space. So we'll put this one on there. And all back in. So I'm going to take the camera down so I can show you. You can see now there's a decent gap right in here for that pulley. And we've got about a 1/4 inch here. This pulley, we put the alternator on almost a week ago now, so it had been stretching in. There was almost a 1/2 inch gap here when we started. So putting a larger pulley in moves this angle over that way a little bit, but it also made the belt have to stretch farther, so it pulled the pulley more that way. So I think, you know, one side of balanced against the other when we're all said and done. But I think that'll be good. And yeah, there's a certain amount of speed reduction by going a 2.5 inch pulley instead of a 2 inch. But to be honest, this car originally had a 45 amp alternator, which was heavy duty in 1970. This is probably 120 amps, so it's just not going to have any trouble even at the reduced speed keeping up to the needs of the car. The only time that this thing really needs any power is if you're running the air conditioning, and we're trying to make that work. That'll be another set of videos later, but I want to get it running first. So anyway, there we go. I think that should be the final bit of the serpentine belt. I thought I'd just go over the carburetor linkage a little bit. Now, I built this linkage when I put the 4-barrel on, which is when it still had the Type 35 transmission. Now, I gotta tell you that if I was doing this now, I would do this differently. But at the time, I had to retain this lever for the kickdown on the Type 35 transmission because it wouldn't reach up to the carburetor. So, on this one, I bought a new bracket here, and this is the package from it. This came from Jegs, Jeggs, here in the United States. So it's a part number 24283, and I've modified it. So there's several kinds of this bracket that just bolts onto the corner, but you want to make sure you get one that has this little strut, this little adjustment screw here, because otherwise they move around a lot. So this is just a great idea. I need to tighten that up. But so this was set up for a GM throttle cable and a GM kickdown cable, and it was much longer. So I've shortened it up, modified this bracket, so that put a slot in it for this, and I put the kickdown cable here and bolted on to an existing leg that came down. And this is the kickdown cable coming through there. So if I move this, you can see how all that goes. So it's the top one's the throttle cable pulling everything back, and the bottom one is the kickdown cable, which will operate the transmission, which obviously is not adjusted yet because it's going to have to get it running and fluid and all that. Once it's set properly, this little ferrule you crimp down at the length that it's supposed to be, because typically these have some preload in them. And this is just a Jegs throttle cable, universal fit. Actually worked pretty well. This bracket, most of this is the original piece that came with the car, and then I added this onto the end. So in the other manifold, the shaft came through and it went through some holes in the casting here and operated the monkey motion linkage for the two carburetors. So this is the original Rover. This is a new shaft that I made. This is an arm that came from Jegs also, which means that's adjustable. You can see this just bolted on at the normal spot, and like I say, I added on this piece to carry the other end of that to hold everything. Like I say, if I was going to do this now, you wind up putting the end of the fixed piece of the cable on top of the throttle linkage, because the throttle linkage, when you push the throttle down, that linkage turns up. And then just pin the end of the cable somewhere down below, bring it up into there, and you'd be done. You could use this as a standard set of these, and wouldn't have to make all this other stuff. Because normally this thing would have been over here somewhere. This thing had a funny little angle piece on it, which worked for this great. I mean, I adjusted the angle with a pair of pliers, but I guess normally you would put a pin here, it would catch the kick-down cable and all that. And then this is just a return spring here. So that's it. I say if you're doing this, leaving the old SU setup on, then I guess you could, this cable could go, your kickdown cable could go back into here just using the original Rover setup. This one was, even for this, was actually a little bit long. This is a Land Rover cable, but they had one for a Jaguar that was a little bit shorter anyway. And it's, you know, that the ZF, they use that transmission in so many different cars. I'd probably just search around and see if I found one that was a more appropriate length. This one could have been the Jaguar cable pretty easily, because I got a bit extra here, but it's alright, it'll work. I really don't want to take the transmission apart and change it out again. And then for the 4-barrel, the Rover had a return line for the gas. So that's this. This is the, I replaced all the nylon lines with steel lines. So this is the gas line coming up. There's a little pressure gauge in here, which was here already. Put a T in for the return line filter into this. This is a Holley 600 CFM 4-barrel vacuum secondaries, which actually works pretty good. 600 CFM is actually probably a bit big for this, but the 390 CFM carburetor that's on the Stag, which works really great, costs twice as much as this. This is about $300, the other one's about $600. So I just thought, you know, it's a bigger motor. This was actually on the 3.5 liter, actually seemed to run fine. Of course, with the Holleys, they're really adjustable. There's jets in here that you can get, I don't know, 20 or 30 different sizes. So, you know, I bought a few different sizes that were close to what I thought it was going to need to be, and swapped them out till I got what I wanted. So that's kind of nice. So I would have been happy to put the 390 CFM on if it had been a little more reasonably priced. When I did the Stag, that was about the same price as this one. I don't know why it costs twice as much now, but so it is. So anyway, that's to that. It's been 3 or 4 days since I shot this video for there, and you can see that this, even though this motor's not run, this is starting to stretch out a bit again. So we got a decent clearance there. So I'm gonna button up the carburetor now. I think we got everything hooked up back in the back. That's the new Dakota unit. We've got air conditioning and stuff coming too, but I think I'm going to make those as a separate set of videos, because I've already got, this will be part 9 on this one. We've got a ways to go. But I'm kind of holding off. I bought a new condenser, and that's got to go in first. And I think I've got an another oil cooler for the transmission, and I'm thinking it might fit in there, but I want to see how much space there is after I put the other condenser in, so we'll see. I still got plumbing to do. I got to hook up the power steering hoses. I got to put up figure out what to do with the oil, external oil lines on the motor oil, and then I got to bring the transmission lines up. They shouldn't be too bad. They're actually just 3/8 like brake line. So when they took the transmission out, they cut off the old line, so I got about 6 or 8 inches. So I'm thinking I can just take my flare tool, put a new end on, and then I can use a double female connector and then bring a couple of hard lines up instead of, you know, I hate running rubber lines that far, particularly when you're that close to the exhaust. So bring the hard lines up and then probably just the last few inches in rubber just to break the connection for vibration. So that's about it for now. I'm just gonna, like I say, you need to button up the carburetor. This goes on here. You know, it's just pretty straightforward stuff. These are the old Rover valve covers, because this motor had the newer valve covers that had the pollution control stuff on, and I wasn't going to go for that. So this was how we dealt with the 2 breathers. They just come up into here. These are actually just a couple of bolts I machined out to fit onto these. I can show you those 2. They threaded into that piece, I guess. Well, that's a rubber washer. It must have just threaded them into the elbows, because there's no load. I mean, it's hardly any vacuum. It's only the vacuum that's inside the air cleaner. So tiny amount of vacuum. It's just a positive crankcase ventilation. This also has vents from the rear here into the carburetor as well, but there's a PCV valve here. But there's no road tube or anything like that on this motor, so you got to do something. And there's my new transmission. It's surprising. Not used to seeing, you know, 4 or 5 inches past the rear of the engine before you get to the firewall, but I guess that's, well, I guess with the heater box on the outside is what really made it that, because they designed this engine bay to put the turbine in that they thought they were going to make. So that would have been an interesting car, but I've seen the P5 turbine at Gaydon, but I don't know, it's just not practical for road use, so they didn't do it. But it does make for an odd front end. It's because the springs are up here and they're in here vertically, and it's just kind of very odd. And considering, you know, they made this engine compartment big, it is just jam full of stuff. Some of it's just kind of like this whole remote slave cylinder. You know, it just, I mean, I see why they did it. There wasn't any room there to put a power booster in, but I don't know. It's just kind of goofy. Anyway, all for now. So I just hooked up the power steering pump. It was actually pretty easy. This is the original line. All I have to do is fit about another foot of line in, and I just put a piece of metal pipe in here to clamp against. You should put a piece of 1/2-inch copper water pipe in, and I knurled the surface just because I was being anal. This is a suction line, so there's not really any pressure. But that brought it right up into here, and it just takes a standard clamp, and that's good. And then the pressure side, this is the original line, and I just cut off, I don't know, 10 inches or so, and I had, this pump came with the very end of the line on it. When they cut it out of the car, they just cut the rubber line and left that piece, which is fortunate for me. I just had them clamp that onto the end of the other hose. Well, actually I did that myself because I have that special tool, but if you took the hose, marked where you want, or cut it to length, and told somebody where you wanted it, and you also want to think about the orientation of the angle, they'll do it for you for a pretty nominal fee, and that'll hook that up. So that was pretty easy for a change. This is the piece of the pipe I used to extend the suction line. It says it's 0.62 inch, which I'm going to guess it's actually 5/8, 350 psi. This is rated for oil. This one's obviously made in the USA. 15.9 millimeters, and that fit perfectly with just a couple of regular hose clamps.